We'd like to welcome everyone to the May Zoom educational meeting of the Florida End-of-Life Doula Association. Today is May 2nd, 2023, and this is the fourth in a four-part series on launching your doula business. We've had three other wonderful programs that are really useful, and this is the one we're going to be talking about, fees and contracts. How important is that? Like, you can start a business, but if you don't have your fees figured out and you don't have a contract, you better, think twice. You really aren't ready to start. So the first half hour, we're going to be looking at fees. And then the second half hour, we have Paul Stern, who is a SCORE mentor. He's going to be providing information about contracts. Fielda is growing. We're really doing quite well right now. This is Fees and Contracts, Launch Your Doula Business, Part 4. Again, our special guest is Paul Stern. And let's talk about money. Woo-hoo. Our taboo topic: sex, death, and money. So people a lot of times, struggle with, like, how do I know what to charge? We're all different. Our experience, our audience, how confident we are, how much we've invested in this work. And so only you know your worth. Your fees depend on who, what, where, when, and why. If someone comes to you and asks, what do you charge for your services? Are you going to say, I don't know? Or are you going to say, my fees are this, and your investment in my services is this? So there is a wide range of fees. It goes all the way from zero to, in our doula, world in Florida, pretty much $150 an hour. So you can volunteer free of charge to hospice or to your client. You could do something like companioning or home care, where you get more hours at a lower rate, perhaps $20 to $50 an hour. Or you can have your flat hourly doula fee, $50 to $100 or $150 an hour. And then some people do a package. So many hours. Once those hours are used up, then you just renew and they give you more money for another set of hours. It's a sliding scale, flexibility, depending on the people's need and your availability. And some people create a scholarship fund. So you put a % of your income into a fund so that when someone does come along with a real need and they don't have money or much money, then you can use that. So the thing here that I really want to emphasize is that we value cooperation, not competition. So you don't want to set your fees to undercut your neighboring doulas. You want to be fair and have each other's back. And then some hospices provide training. So, if you're connected with your hospice and you love the work there, and you're a volunteer and, you're not a doula yet, but you want to be trained, that could be perfect for you. I suppose you'd have to check with the hospice and see what the agreement is about whether they need you to volunteer a certain amount of time or, what their deal is. And then some examples would be, $100 an hour flat rate. But if you're going to be a 3-day vigil where you're actually staying at the house and sleeping there, you might just charge, say, $2,400 for 3 days, which comes to really 3 hours for $100. But it's also, you're going to be sleeping part of the time and you're just kind of hunkering down there. If they've paid you and the person dies, or they don't need you anymore, then you could just refund for the time that is not spent. So it's good for us to keep track of the time. Keep a log, because we don't want the people to have to bother with that. So another example would be a 6-hour package, where if they you get a 10-hour package, they get a little bit of a discount, or a 20-hour package, they get even more off. And then one suggested celebrant rate was $300 to $350 for a service, a funeral service. So sliding scale begins with an honest conversation. You just have to see who they are, what they need, and go from there. And in the area of grief, recovery, education, and support, again, it's going to vary. You have to figure out what's good for you, but some folks do these kind of rates, say a 7-week individual, $9.95, or one-on-one, again, $100 an hour, more or less. And then for groups, say you have an 8-week group, but you have 10 people in that group. So your, your fees, if you charge $625, it would be $6,250 for 8 weeks. That's pretty good, right? And then some people have a hard time committing. And so also when you're doing grief work, they can get scared after a few weeks and run away. So if they really want to pay, I don't mean run away in a bad way, but just leave. So if they just want to pay half, you could just tack on another $100 to the first 4 weeks. And they know that they can not have to fulfill the whole time, but they forfeit that, whatever money they don't use. All right. So as professionals, we deserve respect. And, my thing is that if everyone else in an organization is being paid, including the ones who make the coffee and dust, water the plants and, just all the other folks, then why shouldn't we? We deserve compensation. We're professionals. We work hard to get where we are. So I think, Florida End of Life Doula Association, our effort is to raise the bar and make sure that we are respected, and also that we give quality service and care. So, and of course, you guys all know our website is up now. I hope you know that, and it is fiolba.com. So that's it for this part. Yay. Thanks so much. And then do we want to go ahead and Sharon, did you want to give some input next?
Sure, yes, yeah. I just kind of dive in and, talk about some examples I've seen, while working in the field with just talking to different doulas. I've seen scenarios which I thought was a really great option is to have a hourly rate, whatever your hourly rate is, and then a daily rate. And one of the things I found unique about this particular model that I encountered was that, of course, when we're speaking of, you may spend a day with a client, but you want to, I believe they had it on a just 8-hour day max, because that's more like a working schedule. And then let's say, for example, your rate is $150 an hour. So you would take that daily rate, which would normally be, I guess you would say that would be $1,200 if it was an 8-hour day, but you would discount it to maybe 6 hours and just charge them for the full day. And then that would give them probably about a $600 a daily rate. And then if you had to stay overnight, you charge on top of that daily rate an overnight fee. And other things I found that a lot of people do is they charge cancellation fees, which is, again, what you mentioned, Shanti, is good too. For either charging it on the front end or just having a cancellation fee or a deposit of something of that nature. I've seen that done as well. So I do like, I thought those are really nice, doing things like that, just having the daily rate option, because it tries to, even though you spend an extended amount of time with the family, I believe it kind of discounts it to where it becomes, more palatable, of course, because, they're already going through enough grief and, other things. So try not to do too much of an hardship with the financial aspect by just kind of making those different options for pricing. So yeah, I think that's something to consider as well, different rate plans. I think that's pretty much about all I've seen as far as that, but definitely big on the daily rate. I'll say it again, it really helps. I think so, I believe so. I've just heard a lot of people say it was actually really good.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. And then by the way, Sharon is one of our board members, and I'll just introduce, yeah, we're so glad she's in Jacksonville. We didn't do formal introductions, but the other two that are here today are Terry in West Palm Beach. I think it's West Palm, right? And William in Gainesville. So, okay, William, we'll go to you next.
Sure. I'm going to drop a URL into the chat for the Philly Death Doulas. This last week, I checked in with 6 different collectives and or individuals. Philly Death Doula Collective, the End of Life Colorado Collaborative, Chicago Collective. I reached out to a doula in Vermont, New York City, Portland, and San Francisco. I wanted to cast a wide net and check in with some people who have a very bird's eye view of what's going on in their part of the country. And I had some really interesting conversations that were incredibly helpful. I'm a newly doula finding his practice and trying to figure out how to price myself out. And this has been a question I've been really struggling with in a good way and really been thinking a lot about. I was told nationally on average, $100 to $200 is a pretty common ballpark that people work within. There certainly are people who are $50 and $75 an hour, but $100 to $200 an hour or a session, which is a really generous hour, tends to be what people have been saying to me. There's so many things that go into this, and everyone when they replied to me said, oh, this is such a hard question. I'm frequently asked this question, and it's a really complicated thing that you have to really look. And today, this morning, I had an amazing conversation in which the doula laid out a really rigorous kind of methodology of how she sort of gets to where she's at. She's probably the highest doula I know in America in terms of price point. But she said to me that the factors that she's factoring in when assessing a situation are geography, rural, suburban, urban, socioeconomic ability, if they're working, homeless, or retired, their age, their savings. She tries to anticipate kind of overhead if they have dependents, if they're taking care of parents, retired, pensions, savings, illnesses, how long they've been ill. Medical costs can be devastating, and someone might appear on the surface to be really affluent, but they might be drowning in debt, medical debt specifically, and this is a very common situation. And so she's very careful of Googling her clients because she's in a major metro with really high profile people, really careful about making assumptions because medical debt can be explosive. And so getting an idea of how long someone has an illness, what their insurance status is, if they're pursuing treatments that are on or off insurance, if they're experimental, all really can affect their ability to pay. And so something that she does is asks very frankly, at the end of a call, as they're sort of making introductions to each other, ask what their ability to pay is and to put that on the table. And there was an acknowledgement that this is a hard thing to do, and some people welcomed it and other people didn't, but that it was a really big deal to sort of get that on the table and assess the situation. From contacting everyone across the United States, I have a very clear sense that sliding scale model has a very social justice kind of dimension to it. And the Philly Death Doula has the best, and it was given to me multiple times, as the best tier schedule in which they lay out tiers of $0 to $75 and lay out who they think is in that realm. Tier 2, $75 to $125, and laid out who they thought belonged in that tier. And then $125 to $175 was their tier 3 in their marketplace. Obviously, the cost of living in Florida is so radically different than living in other parts of the United States. And I feel very thankful to have been a very affordable town, even though we have very high property taxes in Gainesville, Florida, very high electrical, but I couldn't have bought a home at the price point that I did in any of the marketplaces that I talked to. And so we have to be really aware of our communities, aware of what's possible for them. I was given the recommendation to check out what a therapist charges in your community, massage therapist charges in your community, or birth doula charges in your community. These can be some really firm kind of metrics to look at to have a sense of what your community can afford on an hourly rate. Many doulas go into packages, and obviously, as Sharon was talking about, sitting vigil is a very time-intensive thing, and that needs to be dealt with, because an hour long or a session with a family, with a client versus a sitting vigil are different things. And so we need to sort of figure out what and how we deal with those things. And that's sort of what I got. Nationally, I think I said $100 to $200 was pretty common. I was given by some doulas that I respect deeply, told me that in the early days, they started at 75 in their marketplaces, but I don't know exactly what time that was. We're in an inflationary moment. $75 a few years ago is real different from today. And so that's my kinds of like research for the week and reaching out with people. Thank you.
I think I have an example of probably not going to happen to everyone, but a doula I spoke with, she was like, well, I'm charging a lot because everybody on my island has their own private plane. I said, oh, okay, so you can charge what you want. She said, yeah, I'll be charging pretty good.
Right, and it's going to vary, and it's going to be like that's why you have to kind of really toss it around and around. And in the chat, someone said that the vigil cost seems high, even 3 days, 2,400. I have money, but boy, that would be hard to pull out. And then if it goes on and on and on and on, and you don't know how long it's going to go on, it can be unbearable for families. So, it's a tricky thing, and there's no easy answers to these things. So one thing we've been wanting to do more of in our meetings, and in the future, we also plan to have some longer meetings, an hour and a half, where we really hear from our people around the state, because we don't want to just be the only ones talking in these meetings. So fortunately, we have a few minutes to really encourage comments, questions, suggestions. And the other thing is just put in the chat anything you want people to know about you. Your email address, your name, where you are is great, because there may be somebody in your neighborhood that you didn't know about. So anybody feel free to unmute and speak up. Chat. Dawn says, I want to know if someone would let me be allowed to do a doula visit. I've still never charged yet, and I've only done volunteer work. Well, the cool thing there is, for example, Lynn, who's the president of our board, she actually has a mentoring program. It might be good to either find someone in your area that you could follow or ask. And again, some of us volunteer with hospice to start out, to get comfortable. The guidance of the nurses, just to be around the dying person and get a feel for it. What's that rattle, or do we swab their mouth, or I don't know, just to feel the energy of it. So if you're new, that's one idea. And I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm working as a doula. I am certified, and about a year now. I've been volunteering with hospice to get the experience. And interestingly, where I live in Sarasota County, we've had one hospice, and it's a very large hospice, and they've tried to keep every other hospice out. There is another one that kind of snuck in. But I mentioned to my volunteer coordinator that I was going to start a business, and she said, well, you can't work with anyone who already has hospice. And I guess this is a little bit off the subject, but can they do that? I mean, can somebody at hospice, if a client were to hire me, can they actually right? So that was nobody's ever heard of that, right? I was like, how can they stop a client from hiring?
Isn't that considered a conflict of interest, though? If you volunteer for hospice because you want the experience and then you take their clients, that's a conflict of interest. So
right. And what I was saying, I wouldn't, yes, of course. And I couldn't take their client. Let's just say it's another person with whom I'm not working. Okay, I see what you're saying. So if I'm a volunteer, maybe I'd have to quit volunteering before I could do it.
If you get the referral outside of the volunteer services, then it's fine. But if you meet that person because a volunteer has told you that they have requested a volunteer, then no, you can't. That's my understanding.
Okay, I'm gonna have to explore that a little bit, because I'm thinking if somebody were to hire me, not in the volunteer capacity, but they already were using hospice, then yeah, if I'm still a volunteer, maybe that wouldn't, even if I had a different client, maybe I still couldn't do it. Okay. I'll have
Well,
to
if you
explore that.
met the person through the hospice that you're volunteering at, yeah, that would be.
No, right. Let's just say
Yeah.
I met them separately, but they already were doing hospice service. You know, I met them on my own. That's the tricky part. They haven't explained to me yet. And it seems, I'm just wondering, I guess nobody else has encountered that yet, because the
You probably
hospice.
would.
I mean, I have, because I'm same. I volunteer at actually I volunteer at the Sun City Center Hospice. My
Okay.
volunteer coordinator has been amazing. But yeah, I'm not, if I meet them through my volunteer role, then
Okay.
I can't be hired by them. If I happen to meet them out and about, or if I do a wellness fair, or and they
Okay.
do have that hospice service, but I've met them outside of that, that's different. Because you're
Yeah.
wearing a different hat. So it all depends on how you meet them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. That makes sense.
I probably would agree with that from my experience as well. And I think it's mainly the conflict, because if you're hired by the hospice organization to be a volunteer, then you have to work within their guidelines and all the restrictions and all the everything you sign with them, you know, as an organization. So you can't take that client outside of there. But of course, if you were to meet that client and they were already receiving hospice and they had a volunteer, your doula role is going to just be supplemental. You're not even going to be doing the same work as a volunteer. The volunteer only works between volunteer hours. They don't do after hours. They don't do a lot of the work doulas do. Your work is completely supplemental and would only add to what the volunteer and the hospice is bringing as far as total, you know, compassionate care for the client. So it's not even in this it's not even comparable, you know.
The only thing, Sharon, is that our hospice in Tidewell does offer, they offer an end-of-life doula program. In other words, they train us, but they only give us a little bit of training. We don't get certified. But they send us out as volunteers, and they don't include us as part of the team. So in other words, I'm working as a doula, but I don't know what's going on because I'm not allowed to be part of the team. In other words, they have their meetings, but I'm not allowed in because I'm a volunteer. So anyway, I'll have to explore.
That's
it's an interesting,
and
Sarasota has really this one, and I don't know if other counties are like that. We just have this one huge hospice that's a big monopoly.
Yeah. Wow,
Yeah, and that goes back to that kind of comment that we had on our little slideshow about we deserve respect. And so you're being of service, but you're kind of out of the loop, and you're being given some tidbit of a training. It's like throwing crumbs, you know. And so the empowering part of actually jumping in and going in as, you know, into your own business is that you call the shots. You're not answering to anyone, and you're not asking them for tidbits. You're, you know, so, but it's, you know, it's kind of an evolutionary, it's, I think we're right on time. It's 6 o'clock, and we kind of wanted to give our second half of the hour to Paul Stern. As I said before, Paul is a SCORE mentor, and I'll let him introduce, Paul, you can unmute and introduce yourself and take it away.
All right, thank you. I'm Paul Stern. I've been working with SCORE for several years, helping companies in the Gainesville area. My background is in technology licensing, working with contracts, dealing with lots of different things, worked in the University of Florida and other major universities. And now I'm focused more on small companies and businesses and working out of my home by myself and frankly, slowing down a bit. That's good. So I've just picked out really some things involved in working with contracts, hopefully more practical than nitty gritty. And hopefully that'll help you when you discuss things with your clients and get things down. So in my view, the contract is to sort of finish that communication so that both parties understand what's going on. Just to be clear, I'm not providing advice, we're just going through some provisions. The contract, and here's the topics that we will go through. And the key to any contract is a meeting of the minds, reaching mutual understanding. And you want to make sure you describe the services, explain how your performance is going to be delivered, what the time is, both in terms of hours and throughout the calendar. A little bit about warranties and liability. I was asked to touch on copyrights, intellectual property, so we'll have a little bit about that and go from there. A lot of people ask this question right off the bat. Of course, I'm a lawyer. Of course, you need an attorney. Actually, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. You can do a contract, and you're probably better off if you can't afford or don't want to afford an attorney. Getting something in writing that you can understand and that your client can understand. And you do call your people clients, is that correct? So
Yes.
There are resources to help you along. They're kind of commercial and pushy at times, but LegalZoom can be helpful. They'll write a contract for you. They'll file a copyright. There's a group called NOLO on the internet you can find, and your local bar association. There's information for not only finding attorneys, but there's some information you can often find that will help you do some contracts. Again, if you put something down on paper, it's understandable. It's a lot better than not having anything, at least in my view. Again, to me, the most important thing that you're reflecting the mutual agreement of the parties. And in general, there are some illegal or fraudulent things you can't agree to, but if two people get together, they want to agree to something, even if it doesn't perhaps seem fair, you can agree to it. It has to be pretty skewed in order for something to be subject to being thrown out. But be clear, use normal language that you use every day, perhaps not slang, but formal language. But as I always say, don't try to put in heretofores and whereas and other kinds of legalese. Frankly, I don't use it in my practice, and it's bad enough when lawyers do it, but it's even worse when others do. So the key here is make sure that your client understands, and the goal with your contract and any contract is to avoid having any disputes later on. And I'm going to kind of emphasize that as we go forward. It's always mutual agreement, being clear, understanding, making sure that both parties understand. And while a lot of times people just accept a contract because that's what they're given, they think they have no choice, but it may be important to bat it around a little bit, to negotiate some terms and make sure that both parties understand what the legal relationship is, not just the things that you provide as an end-of-life doula. Make sure that your right to cancel and the client's right to cancel are clearly spelled out. It's a hard thing to do anything when those kind of things happen. Frankly, if you get terminated, I would, and I've never done this and probably wouldn't either, but you're not going to go after your clients when they don't pay their things. Things are usually bad enough, but it could be. And if you have an agreement, that will give you something to stand on. The other thing is important in the agreement to make sure that both you and your client understand that this is the agreement. We may have talked about some other things, but if we didn't put it in the agreement, it's not part of the contract. And if there's something you think of later, then you're going to need to change the contract or add to the contract, or just write a letter that you both sign and say we're amending the contract because we didn't think of whatever that situation that may have arisen that you want to go forward. But don't just talk to somebody to modify your contract. Make sure that it's written down, just like your agreement is to start with. If you are using an attorney, understand that this is your agreement. It's not the attorney's agreement. If your attorney is pushy and tells you what to do, make sure you understand it and you agree. And if you don't agree, make sure that's known. And if you don't get along with the attorney, find somebody else. Fortunately or unfortunately, there are plenty of us out there. And I can't emphasize enough, don't use legalese, make it simple. Use language that you and your client understand, and understand that all your clients may not be the same. And you discuss that in your discussion of the fees. It's going to be different from the person who has their own private plane than the person who's, barely struggling to get by. So understand that sometimes your contract might need to be tweaked. And while it looks like a form that you're just going to give to everybody, it may be something you need to modify or massage for each person. And I can't emphasize enough, it's your document, it's not the lawyer's document. The lawyer may write it, but you're the one who signs it, and you're the one who's going to be responsible. So be careful about that. I think the time of performance, especially in and you really touched on it a lot, talking about fees, is important, both in terms of the broader calendar and in terms of the hours that go by each time. If your agreement spans over a long period of time, you want to make sure that's clear. And again, I can't emphasize clarity enough. But if your client understands what you're going to devote to your services, then you guys are on the same page. And again, the chances of there ever being a dispute go way, way down. Some things you want to be careful about are guaranteeing results. There are some contracts that you probably signed yourselves where you thought there might have been a guarantee, but because that's what the ad said. But when you look at the document, it isn't even close to that. But in your case, I think you want to represent that you have the qualifications, the certifications, or whatever to do what you're doing, but understand that in the end, how it comes out is not a guarantee. Again, make sure that there's mutual understanding there. Here's my intellectual property slide. I highly doubt that you're talking about inventions and patents. You may get a little bit into trademarks or service marks, but it's not the key. But copyrights are probably something that you'll deal with if you give out materials or if you use others materials. The risks, unfortunately, especially in using other people's materials, are pretty great, because only if the consequences are great. The risk may or may not be great, but if you use somebody else's materials, make sure you have permission to use somebody else's materials. There is a concept called fair use, which allows you to use copyrighted materials without permission legally, it's very complex. It's not, you can't just add up the score and decide that it's fair use. It's really, it's a complicated scenario, and so the best way to proceed is to make sure you have permission to do it. A lot of times, if you're using somebody's material on the web, if you dig down into the web page a little bit, you'll find a license there, and a lot of times those say you're free to use it, or sometimes they'll say you're free to use it as long as you tell people that it's ours. Other times it will say, you know, make sure you ask for permission, or there may be really strong prohibitions against it. But I strongly recommend you make sure that you know that you have permission. And the other side of this is to probably clearly make sure your clients understand, if you're handing them something that you wrote or put together, that it is yours, and they can do what they want with it other than distribute it or make copies or change it and use it for their own uses. And you should have a clear understanding about that, because there may be times that the client says, well, I paid you to do this, you gave me this, so I should be able to do whatever I want with it. I guess the extreme example might be they want to go out and start their own doula business. But those are the kinds of things you need to be careful about. And in a short amount of time, that's kind of the synopsis of things that sort of jumped out to me that would concern you in the area of intellectual property. You talked about that you do have certifications, something you should represent, that you have the license, maybe a broad representation that you're complying with the law. And then aside from legal obligations, it may be useful. I don't know if there are ethical principles that doula associations have, but if they're out there, it may be useful to cite those as well. And in the beginning, I mentioned that, you know, the big goal of having a contract is to avoid disputes. You don't want to get in front of a judge on something like this. You want to avoid that as much as possible, but things happen. There are misunderstandings, even if you thought that it was the clearest thing in the world. Excuse me, my recommendation is a provision in there that if disputes do arise, you'll get together and try to hammer it out before you go into filing lawsuits. And mediation is a good sort of middle ground rather than arbitration, in my view. Mediation involves sitting down with a neutral party who may have you all in a room, may have you in separate rooms, and go back and forth and hopefully help you understand the other side's issues and help the other side understand your issues. And they're very, very successful in resolving disputes to mutual satisfaction. But a lot of times, if you just get together and talk about it, even if it's after the fact, you can resolve things. And so I like to put a simple provision in lots of my agreements. Before you do anything, we'll get together and talk. Sometimes you can make that as detailed as you want. We'll spend 30 days discussing it before we go out. We will, and if we don't reach an agreement that way, we'll hire a mediator, or we'll hire three mediators. You know, each hire a mediator, and the mediator will hire another one. It can get very involved. I don't think that's something that you need to get into. I would use really brief language in your agreements. But again, the biggest goal in getting something clear and concise and understandable by both sides is to avoid disputes of any kind. And that's what I got.
That's pretty good. Hey. Thank you. It's very good.
We do have some time. I can take questions. There are a couple of provisions in those documents that I received ahead of time I could go through that are kind of important.
You can drop it in the box so everybody knows that if they want to look at it as well.
Okay, so, but I'd, rather see if there are any questions first. If not, I can go through those. I see we have a little time left. Well, things I touched on earlier, make sure that you write down the whole agreement. Don't rely on some discussion that you had separately. And if you happen to have forgotten something you think you should put in there, go back and write an amendment. It doesn't have to be that complicated. I think most of your agreements are going to be local, but if there are ever any interstate transactions that you enter into, or you travel to do these things, you might want to make sure you have a governing law provision so that if you do get into that bad situation, you know where you're going to go and you don't have to have that fight. But it seems like you're almost always going to be in one place, so there shouldn't be too much controversy about that.
Well, and not necessarily. You might go out of Florida to do some work. So you're saying the governing law of the state that you're in. What kind of statement would you put there?
Well, I would make it the law, the governing law of your state. If you don't want to be forced into traveling to Oklahoma to answer a lawsuit, you want to make them come to you. And it's really it's more a matter of cost than anything else. Not only do you have to travel, but you have to find somebody in Oklahoma to represent you. And it's not, it could be viewed unreasonable. Somebody else might insist that it's the other way around. But if you leave it, if you don't agree on that to begin with, that can be a fight from the start. So if you're working with somebody in Ohio, you come to a disagreement, they file a lawsuit first, they're going to file it in their local forum. You might send a lawyer up there or hire somebody in Ohio, and they're going to say, well, this really wasn't an Ohio dispute because my client is from Florida and they do all their business in Florida, and the client, it'll go on, and those are the kind of disputes you don't want to have before you even get to the merits of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's all. I think your presentation is so important because it's probably a side of our work that some of us haven't examined very closely, and it's so important, really. We cover ourselves.
I see Don, you asked about the Zoom. Yeah, I think that would still go with the same if you're conducting a Zoom session. If you're the doula, I think the contracting laws would still apply where you're conducting your service at. I would always keep mine in Florida. I think I agree with that. So even though I go out of state, I still would stay with Florida because I'm comfortable in my county and anything else.
Yeah, you definitely want to try and these kinds of things. I don't think that's often going to be an argument. People are going to accept these things, but better to know that before you go in than have that be not in the agreement and open to a big discussion. And governing law without a contractual provision can be tricky.
And I think that kind of goes back also to this work is so personal and so deeply personal, and so how we choose our clients or how they choose us, but we also get to vet and choose them. Like you got to have a vibe. Like you just have to have a synchronicity and a sense that you want each other, that you trust each other. And it's so I don't think that kind of thing would come up very often. I really don't. But it's just good to be aware of it.
Yeah, there may be situations where you're doing a broader thing, maybe even a presentation like this, and there may be clients in the audience, and you want to make sure if something happens that it's the right state. But and again, because of the relationship that you're describing, if you hire an attorney to give you an agreement and they come back with a 25-page document, I think that's really going to turn people off. So make it simple, or make sure that the lawyer understands what the relationship is and what you want this to look at. These people, I mean, it's hard enough, all the other contractual matters they're going through at that point in their lives and dealing with their personal issues. I don't think you want to add on to that too much.
We've got a question about advanced care planning across state lines. I actually this morning was looking at AARP and saw some things, but absolutely we have to be aware and versed in the states that we're in. Zoom is unhinged that, but Paul, if you have any thoughts about that, we have someone asking about advanced care planning in other states and sort of the impact of that legally.
Yeah, I really can't address that. That's really far away from what I've ever dealt with.
I kind of go to caringinfo.org because you can go to each particular state and you can look up their laws in regards to it. And that's kind of where I go. Or even if I don't want to get into advanced care planning, I refer the client and their family to this particular website so they can look at this state and they can get the documents for their state specific and they can download them and fill them, complete them. Or, you know, and I can help them with them if that's something I want to do as part of my service. But they tend to have all the states listed there and all the different documents for each state.
And this is the power of referrals. It's so important to sort of figure out when you've reached your limit of where you have exposure and how much exposure you're willing to take it on. But it's so important to just understand that kind of state by state, there's such different places. Should we give a shout out to SCORE by any chance? I think it's such an amazing organization.
Oh,
Yeah.
Anything you want to say about SCORE and finding a mentor? It's such a phenomenal organization. Shanti are both, and I think Sharana all have really appreciated the resources.
Yes.
yes, absolutely. I don't know if I mentioned it, but Paul has been my mentor with SCORE, and it's been invaluable. Yeah, it's great.
There are programs all the time, and if you snoop around the website score.org, if you have a question about running your business, even without getting a mentor, you can get a lot of information. But getting a mentor, I think, really helps. It helps keep you on track to get the nitty-gritty done that you may have a difficult time with. And if the mentor you find isn't perfect for you, you can get somebody else. You can, and they don't even have to be in the SCORE chapter in your area. You know, if you need expertise that they don't have, they'll find it for you. It's a wonderful group.
Okay, I guess, gee, if there are no more questions or comments, that's a sign of a very satisfying presentation, I think. Everyone's really picked up a lot here. So I want to thank everyone.